to come back to your question about the effectiveness of monetary policy when people just want to hold money, right? Great question. So here's that reading, right, in the ISLM reading. Towards the end of the reading, it talks about fiscal policy and monetary policy. So in the ISLM, our fiscal policy, normal case, we increase government spending. We have both an increase in output and an increase in interest rates. Alternatively, we have expansionary monetary policy. So our LM curve shifts to the right. We have an increase in output and an increase in interest rates. Okay? What happens then if our LM curve is horizontal, which was the question you asked? When we have a horizontal LM curve, that is called as a liquidity trap. Okay? Horizontal LM curve is the same, arises from a horizontal money demand curve. Okay? So horizontal LM curve, what happens, the only way that you affect output then is through fiscal policy. Okay? Alternatively, what happens if you have a vertical LM curve? Okay? Then fiscal policy doesn't work to increase output. It only increases interest rates, right? In that case, your best policy option is monetary policy. Okay? So when our money demand curve is horizontal, so people will hold any quantity of money no matter what, monetary policy doesn't work, then you want to focus on fiscal policy. If money demand, if the quantity that people are holding of money is always going to be constant, they don't respond at all to the interest rates, in other words, they don't change their money demand holdings, then expansionary fiscal policy does not work. Right. Okay. So the transmission process, the Reserve Bank changes interest rates, output changes, prices change. Let's zoom in on this quickly. So what happens when the Reserve Bank lowers the repo rate? Other short-term rates and banking rates and exchange rates fall. The quantity of money and the supply of loanable funds increases. Okay. Long-term interest rates fall, consumption, expenditure, investment, net exports, all of those things increase. Aggregate demand increases, GDP increases, but so does inflation. Okay? So this diagram here is a summary of this little paragraph here. Okay, this paragraph summarized as this diagram. And then obviously the reverse is also the case. The Reserve Bank raises the repo rate. What happens? Real GDP growth and the inflation rate decrease. Okay. So what happens in the loanable funds market? Demand and supply in the loanable funds market are obviously linked to the interest rate. In the long run, demand and supply in the loanable funds market depends on real forces, on savings and investments decisions. But in the short run, the supply of loanable funds is influenced by the supply of bank loans. Okay? So changes in the repo rate change the supply of bank loans, which changes the supply of loanable funds, which changes the interest rate in the loanable funds market. Okay? So it's just an extension of that entire process. Remember, we said when you change the repo rate, it changes the bank's lending rates and it changes other interest rates. In other words, it changes interest rates in loanable funds markets, for example. Okay? Change in interest rates in loanable funds markets affects investment spending. So, change in the repo rate changes the supply of bank loans and it changes the supply of loanable funds. Okay? When you change bank loans, you also change things like savings. Okay? So it changes supply of loanable funds. And then obviously there's a ripple effect that follows from a change in the repo rate. What happens to consumption expenditure? The lower the real interest rate, the greater is the amount of consumption expenditure and the smaller is the amount of saving. Okay? That's one effect on savings. However, a lower real interest rate is usually associated with an increase in bank loans, and an increase in bank loans leads to an increase in deposits, which is an increase in savings. So on the consumption side, we have an increase in consumption and lower savings, but on the investment side, the lower interest rate also increases savings. Okay? So remember, when we have an increase in output, we have an increase in income. An increase in income leads to an increase in both consumption and savings. So even if the proportion of our income that we are consuming is increasing, our savings can still be going up. You get what I'm saying? So in other words, even though we might be saving less, as a proportion of the extra income we are earning, because we are earning more income, we can still be saving more. Right? Okay. So we can have an increase in consumption as well as an increase in investment spending. And then obviously the net exports, the lower the interest rate, the weaker is the exchange rate, and the greater are exports and the smaller are imports. Okay? Again, chapter 26, we'll talk in detail about how that happens. Chapter 26 will be our final discussion just on how everything fits together. And we'll look at our ASAD model and our, aggregate expenditure model, and the money market, and the exchange rate, and the, the employment market, the labor market, and put all that together and see how it all works. Okay, change in aggregate demand, real GDP, and the price level. By changing real GDP and the price level relative to what they would have been without a change in the repo rate, the Reserve Bank influences its ultimate goal, which is the inflation rate. The Reserve Bank can fight a recession if inflation is low and real GDP is below potential GDP. Okay, how do we end up in that sort of a situation? Remember, we said this tends to be how the economy operates. Prices tend to be stickier on the downside, below potential. So you can be below potential with very minimal changes in prices. So we can say if we're below potential with low inflation, the Reserve Bank takes actions that are designed to restore full employment by increasing aggregate demand with minimal effect on inflation. What is the market for bank reserves? We've kind of touched on this already. To achieve a new target, the Reserve Bank buys securities and supplies just enough reserves to reach the target repo rate. Yeah, that might be the case in places like the UK, but in fact in South Africa that's not actually how we do it. We'll talk about that in a moment. So we have something called the money market, and a decline in the cost of funds for banks causes banks to lower their lending rates and the demand for loans increases. With increased reserves, the bank makes more loans, and these loans lead to deposits and the supply of money increases. Okay? So the money market is how our repo rate affects the bank's lending rates. Okay? That's through the money market. What happens in the money market? If you have a decline in the cost of funds for banks, in other words, you lower the repo rate, you lower the baseline rate at which banks can borrow, then banks lower their lending rates as well. Okay? Because remember, lending in South Africa usually happens according to repo rate plus 3.5% gives you prime. So if the repo rate goes down, banks' lending rates go down. Okay? So in the money market, the decline in the cost of funds for banks causes banks to lower their lending rates, and the demand for loans increases. Okay? Lower interest rates increase in the quantity of people borrowing, right? With increased reserves, alternatively, right? In other words, through the money market, if the Reserve Bank is purchasing securities to lower the interest rate through open market operations, that increases bank reserves, therefore banks loan more. Okay? What happens in the loanable funds market? When banks create money, that creation of money increases the supply of loanable funds. An increase in the supply of bank loans increases the supply of loanable funds. What happens in the actual economy, in other words, when we're dealing with real GDP? Well, the increase in the supply of loans and the decrease in the real interest rate causes aggregate planned expenditure, and then for some reason it just cuts off. But obviously this should say to increase. So here's what it looks like as a diagram, and this is what we'll focus on. So get out a pen and a paper, piece of paper, or a book or whatever. Doesn't have to be a pen. Take out your tablet and chisel, and let's go. The idea here is, in terms of your the textbook, it separates the market in which commercial banks borrow from the Reserve Bank from the money market. Okay? The way that we usually summarize these two diagrams is just to say that the money market has a vertical money supply and downward sloping money demand. Okay? They split this market into, first of all, a vertical supply of loanable funds, and then an upward sloping supply of money through the banking system. But this upward sloping supply of money is derived from this vertical supply of reserves. Okay? In other words, the repo, the amount of money that the Reserve Bank makes available through the repo lending at its discount window. Okay? So when you increase reserves, you increase money supply through the bank, not increase reserves, sorry. When you increase the funds available to banks, okay? You increase the funds available to banks, how? By decreasing the repo rate. When you decrease the repo rate, you increase the supply of money, which lowers the lending rate in money markets. Okay? We summarize this usually as just saying the money supply curve is vertical and controlled by the Reserve Bank. When the Reserve Bank increases the money supply, sorry, I can't draw it over here, but when it increases the money supply, you have a movement down a money demand curve, which is exactly what you end up with here, a movement down the money demand curve. Movement down a money demand curve with lower interest rates. Movement down a money demand curve, lower interest rates. Okay? So the diagram we usually use, which is this vertical money supply curve and downward sloping money demand, is kind of just combining these two diagrams together. Okay? The way that the textbook explains it is to say that when the Reserve Bank wishes to lower the repo rate, right? So it makes an announcement, we are lowering the repo rate. What the Reserve Bank then does is it conducts an open market purchase of bonds, which increases the supply of money that banks can borrow, right? In other words, it increases their reserve holdings at the Reserve Bank. It increases the money supply. Okay? That's not actually how it happens in the South African economy, because the Reserve Bank just found that this open market operations thing was too inexact. It didn't give the repo rate that they wanted. So now what they just do is they say, cool, here's the repo rate, right, market, you do what you want. Okay? So the Reserve Bank just says, here's the repo rate, go. Okay? So it doesn't necessarily get involved in any kind of open market operations in order to make the market rate respond to the repo rate. It just says what the repo rate is and the market responds naturally. The Reserve Bank does not try and keep the rate in the market at which banks borrow from one another and from the Reserve Bank. It doesn't try and keep that market basically at exactly the repo rate. It just says, here's the repo rate, go. Okay, so technically this part of this discussion doesn't really apply to the South African economy. So the Reserve Bank lowers the repo rate, which is the same as increasing the money supply by increasing the reserves that banks have available at the Reserve Bank, which then allows them to increase the money supply by granting new loans, which lowers the interest rates in the money market, in the banking money market. Okay, that decrease in interest rates mirrors the decrease in the repo rate that the Reserve Bank initially started with. That increase in money supply also increases the supply of loanable funds in other interest or in other lending markets, right? Which then lowers the interest rates in those markets as well. Okay, that decrease in interest rates in general leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Why? Because any kind of interest sensitive spending increases. For example, investment. The lower interest rate, as you can see, we have a movement down, a demand for loanable funds. And who demands loanable funds? People that want to invest. So lower interest rate leads to an increase in the quantity of loanable funds demanded. In other words, it's an increase in the quantity of investment spending. Increase in investment spending due to a lower interest rate shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay. We then have a multiplier effect, which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right even further. And what we see is that when the Reserve Bank lowers interest rates and increases money supply, aggregate demand shifts to the right. We have an increase in output, right? We have an increase in output. However, there is a problem in the sense that there is also an increase in prices, okay? And that increase in prices means, we can expect inflation. So why would the Reserve Bank do that if its mandate is to control inflation? Because usually when we are in a recessionary environment, we tend to have an environment in which prices are very sticky downwards, and we can increase aggregate demand without having much of a price effect. Okay? So this kind of Reserve Bank intervention in a recession is possible with minimal inflationary effects. Okay? There is a problem if we have something called stagflation. So stagflation, what happens? We have a shift to the left in short run aggregate supply. We get inflation and we have a recession. If the Reserve Bank then increases the money supply, we have even more inflation. So we deal with the recession, but we have an inflationary problem. Okay, so whatever, the monetary transmission mechanism, the Reserve Bank fights inflation. How does the Reserve Bank fight inflation? So what I want you to do with your piece of paper and your pen, you draw the money market and you draw the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Okay, you can draw them initially in equilibrium. Then for whatever reason, there's an increase in aggregate demand leading to inflation. Okay, what does the Reserve Bank do? Okay, so the question is, based on our slide here, the Reserve Bank wants to fight inflation, okay? Fight inflation. How do we fight inflation as the Reserve Bank? Well, let's show it diagrammatically. So we're going to have a money market. And we're going to have an ASAD. You can put it in long run equilibrium initially if you want to, but you certainly don't have to. If you were initially at equilibrium, you would have been through there. Okay, we've had an increase in aggregate demand. Our output has increased, but got another problem here. prices have increased. Okay? So we've got inflation. What should the Reserve Bank do? Okay, so how does drawing these diagrams work, by the way? I mean, as a teaching aid. Do you find them useful? So then if we've got the loanable funds market, and we can just kind of give a summary of the loanable funds market, the only thing that's really important to us is an investment demand curve, right? So, sorry, let's do this. So demand for investment, okay? So investment spending is inversely related to the interest rate. So this is just kind of like what I would call a quick version, I guess, of the loanable funds market. So this is, let's call it that, quick and dirty version of the loanable funds market. Okay, so what happens? The Reserve Bank is trying to fight inflation. If it's fighting inflation, it wants to bring prices. Okay, so to fight inflation, it wants to bring prices down. Yeah? In order to bring prices down, it doesn't have any effect on the labor market. It can't tell firms not to hire people, or can't tell laborers to change their wages or whatever. So how does the Reserve Bank fight inflation? It wants to bring prices down. It can do that by decreasing aggregate demand. How does it decrease aggregate demand? If it decreases the money supply, in other words, it raises the repo rate, we've seen in those diagrams that that's equivalent, whether we want to say raising the interest rate or we want to say decreasing the money supply, it's the same thing. What happens? When we decrease money supply, we increase interest rates, okay? So that's why it's the same thing. The Reserve Bank increases the interest rate by decreasing the money supply, okay? Did I say, yeah, increase the interest rate, decrease the money supply. When it increases the interest rate, what happens in the loanable funds market? Well, let's go with some interest rate R0 corresponding to some interest rate R0, okay? When interest rates increase from R0 to R1, what happens in our loanable funds market? Our interest rates also increase. And the demand for things like investment or any other interest sensitive expenditure, so this is investment, let's do this, investment, which is just a proxy for any kind of interest sensitive expenditure, interest sensitive expenditure. Okay. Increase in interest rate decreases that expenditure, right? In other words, the quantity of investment decreases from I0 to I1. So what happens to our aggregate demand? Well, this was aggregate demand when we had investment spending I0. When we have a lower level of investment spending, what happens to aggregate demand? Aggregate demand shifts to the left, and if we shift it by the right amount, and we have AD now a function of a lower level of investment level I1, aggregate demand shifts to the left. What happens to our inflation? Decreases. There is a bit of a problem though, because what happens to output? Output also falls. That's not great. But there is one reason why that's not such a big problem, because what tends to happen in practice is that when we are above potential GDP, our short-run aggregate supply curve is actually pretty steep, right? Which means when we shift aggregate demand to the left, and we have a big effect on inflation and a very small effect on output. You see that? we've got a vertical aggregate supply curve, and we shift our if we have a vertical aggregate supply curve and we shift our aggregate demand to the left, our inflation, our prices fall significantly, but our output hardly changes. You see that? Okay. Do you need do you want to have a second to just take that down, finish taking that down, or are you all happy? Okay, so we spoke about the idea that the Reserve Bank, through its monetary policy, can fight inflation, but it has a downside in the sense that it also affects employment. Okay? Not usually a big issue, or in practice not usually a big issue, because what we want to say is the Reserve Bank would use a contractionary monetary policy, usually when we are above full employment, and you tend to have a very steep aggregate, short-run aggregate supply curve above the potential level anyway. And you're going to use expansionary monetary policy when you're below potential, where the short-run aggregate supply curve tends to be relatively flat anyway. Okay? So that sort of counteracts the negative effects of monetary policy. What I was illustrating earlier, however, is that if you do have, for example, a situation where your LM curve is flat, okay, which corresponds to a flat money demand curve, so you have something called a liquidity trap. In fact, your monetary policy is totally ineffective anyway. Okay? In which case, it's better to use fiscal policy to try and increase output. But there are circumstances in which fiscal policy is ineffective, okay, because the LM curve is vertical, and any increase in government spending just automatically increases interest rates without any increase in output. Then monetary policy is useful because monetary policy shifts the LM curve to the right, which would lower interest rates and increase output. Okay, so whereas fiscal policy is ineffective with a vertical LM curve, monetary policy is ineffective when you have a horizontal LM curve. So there are arguments for when it's appropriate to use fiscal policy and when it's appropriate to use monetary policy to influence the economy to achieve whatever your ultimate policy goal may or may not be. Are there alternative strategies? Yes, there are. Alternative monetary strategies. We're referring to an inflation targeting rule. You don't necessarily have to have an inflation targeting rule. Other kinds of rules that we, as the South African economy, has used, and other economies as well have used. We haven't necessarily used all of them, but these have been used elsewhere. You can have a money base instrument rule. In other words, instead of targeting the interest rate, which is what we do, you actually target the money base. In other words, that vertical money supply curve, if you make that vertical money supply curve your target, that's different to targeting the interest rate itself. Okay? Even though we talk about them interchangeably, they are separate, they are different strategies. Okay? So you can have a money base rule. You could have a money targeting rule. So in other words, instead of saying, right, this is what we want our target inflation rate to be, in other words, this is what we want the growth in prices to be over time, you can say, ignore prices, this is what we want money to be. This is how we want money to grow over time. Okay? So that's an alternative kind of monetary policy rule. Or you can target your exchange rate. Okay? We'll see that it's really difficult to target both your interest rate and your exchange rate at the same time. Okay? So usually you choose one or the other. Sorry, the interest rate, the inflation rate. When you target the interest rate, you're using the interest rate to target the inflation rate, right? And it's difficult to target both the inflation rate and your exchange rate, right, at the same time, because they tend to pull in opposite directions. So you have two broad categories of monetary policy strategies, which is to say two alternative decision-making strategies might be used in a monetary framework. You can have an instrument rule or you can have a targeting rule. So we use a targeting rule. So we don't actually target money supply, we target an inflation rate. An instrument rule says set the policy instrument at a level that is based on the current state of the economy, for example, a Tailor Rule. Okay? What is in a Tailor Rule? A Tailor Rule says, right, you must set the interest rate at the equilibrium interest rate, which is 2%, okay, so it's based on the US economy. It says, right, equilibrium interest rate from historic data should be about 2%, okay? So at the moment we said that the US interest rate is around 0.5%, 1%, thereabouts. But remember, the US has had a massive recession, right? And is still in the process of trying to get out of that recession. And the central bank in the US has been saying for the last 18 months, look, we can't keep interest rates this low, like forever. We have to start raising these interest rates, right? So anyway, normally historically it sits at about 2%. So the Tailor Rule would say, right, what is the full employment rate of interest, right? And in the US that works out to about 2%. It says, cool. If we know that that's 2%, then we should set our interest rate at 2% and then adjust it, so plus some amount based on what the inflation rate is. So if our inflation rate is high, then we have an interest rate that's 2% plus an inflation rate. And what about an output gap, right? If our output gap is high, then increase the interest rate. If our output gap is low, decrease the interest rate. So in other words, the way that this looks, the Tailor Rule would say something along the lines of the following. Set your interest rate equal to your equilibrium interest rate plus the difference between your actual inflation and what your target inflation is. Oh, sorry, let me do that differently. What your target inflation is and what is your actual output. What is your actual level of output minus your full employment level of output, and that's how you should set your interest rate. Okay? So then it's not targeting inflation, it's saying this is what our interest rate should always be, and we should adjust it according to the following. Okay? So it's not targeting an interest rate, right? It's giving a rule for how interest rates should evolve given what the economy is doing. Okay, so that's an instrument rule. And basically, this is our last slide. So what we'll do next week is we'll just pick up again, just with these diagrams. We'll just recap quickly these diagrams, and then the difference between an instrument rule and a Tailor Rule, and that finishes off chapter 31 for us. So that's excellent. We're on track. Next week, Wednesday, finish this off and then do our chapter 26. Okay. Thank you. Any questions or any issues? Come along.